Welcome back to Small Caps. My name's Kerry Stevenson, and today we're going to be hearing from Southern Gold. ASX code is SAU. They are exploring for gold in South Korea. Who knew? Joining me today is Simon Mitchell, their Managing Director. Simon, great to see you. Welcome back to Small Caps.
Thanks very much, Kerry. Good to be back.
Before we go into a couple of the things I want to cover today, a couple of recent announcements, if you could just explain to our listeners a brief overview on who are Southern Gold.
Well, Southern Gold is essentially a country play focused on South Korea only and focused on precious metals. So we're looking for gold and to a lesser extent, silver deposits. We're looking for world-class systems. And by that, I mean, tier one, really valuable deposits, multi-million ounce type epithermal deposits, principally in the sort of southern half of South Korea.
All righty. I'm going to come back to that because there's you did a couple of things there which piqued my interest, tier one, major discoveries. But before we go into that, let's just go into the recent announcement, which was with your joint venture partner, BMV. I was about to call it DMV. BMV. If you can explain why you think this recent announcement is good for shareholders and a bit about the background.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so in addition to exploring for these deposits, we've also done a deal recently with BMV, a London-listed company that we were in joint venture with on two of our projects, Gubong and Kochang. And essentially what we did there was a equity swap where we exchanged 50% interest in an unlisted private company based out of Singapore for 200 million BMV shares, which is listed in London. And a big driver of that, Kerry, was really, one day we had an equity interest in, an invisible joint venture company, and today we hold a number of shares in a publicly listed company with a very obvious see-through value. So on a mark-to-market basis, something worth $13-14 million Australian.
Worth 13 to 14, not in a cash, but in a sort of value side of things.
Yes, yeah, on a mark-to-market, that's right. The equity value, if you will, is worth about that. Now, look, we've only got 50 million of the 200 million shares so far. The other 150 million will come once they produce their prospectus under the London system. They've got to go through a process before they can issue that the balance of that stock. That, my understanding is that's a relatively generic exercise. It'll probably take in the order of 4 or 5 months. But certainly by the end of this year, we will have around about 30 to 33% of BMV.
And so BMV is, why was that important to get that mark-to-market deal done? Well,
there are two elements to it, Gary. One is I think we weren't getting a lot of value for that joint venture in the market. And I kind of get it. In a way, the way the BMV guys develop mines is very much outside the JORC code. And as you know, I'm constrained by the JORC code and what I can announce here in Australia, how that gets promoted, etc. And so I found that what was happening is that there was a little bit of a disparity between perhaps the story as it was appreciated in London versus the story as it was appreciated here in Australia. Okay. This way, I think it's a way for us to then just rely on the disclosures that have been made by BMV in London, so we can point to those and say, well, this is what's, how it's being promoted as an operation. And then secondly, and perhaps this is a more medium to longer term thing, we've got an equity instrument that's going to be quite valuable. As they move towards production, I expect their share price to appreciate. As they get closer to that first gold pour, then these equity positions should actually be significantly more valuable. In that scenario, we may be in a position to liquidate a proportion of that holding and be able to fund some of our future exploration business, perhaps, 3-4 years from now.
So when you say that they're going to be setting up this mine, is that one of that was the joint venture project? Was that?
That's right.
I can never pronounce these right, Simon. Kochang?
Kochang, yes.
Hey,
and Gubong.
And Gubong. But it's
right.
Kochang. It's Kochang that's the first off the mark. Is that correct?
Almost certainly, I think so. Yes, I think the ability to move that project forward faster than the other one will probably mean it's just for a whole bunch of different reasons, including the approval process and the relationships with local people and so forth. I think the Kochang project is more likely to move forward in the near term. At the end of the day, though, BMV will be in charge, so it's their call, and they're the ones that are going to be basically the operators, aren't they? We're no longer in joint venture with them. We're now a shareholder. We'll obviously keep a very close eye on what happens, and we'll take a lot of interest in seeing those projects move closer to production. Obviously, Southern Gold too has a very significant position in country. We've got a team there. We've got all the networks. And look, no doubt, we're in a position to assist Bluebird, perhaps in some subtle ways. But at the end of the day, it's their operation, and they will drive it as they see fit.
Yeah, and I guess it was good when you said before that there's different reporting styles and there's different ways of sending things out to market. This is a much cleaner way forward for both parties, I guess. But given the fact that you're going to have over 30% of BMV, are you going to get a seat at the board?
We have the right to have one. So under our legal agreement with them, as long as our shareholding is north of 15%, we have a right to appoint someone to the board. We won't do that, obviously, in the first instance. So we'll wait and see how things unfold. It's something that we reserve as a right in the future, Kerry. But look, at the end of the day, I think the shareholding will speak for itself. It's a significant shareholding, and look, it brings its own ability to influence events, shall we say. Don't necessarily need to sit on the board to do that. Yes. We're not trying to drive BMV. We're not there to judge its or try and drive its strategy or anything like that. And if we sort of step away from it a bit, it also means that, we're a little bit more concentrated, if you will, on our core business, which is exploration in South Korea.
Yeah. One of the things I was going to ask about, and it was something to do with BMV. So they're going to get on with what they're doing.
Yep.
You actually need to start focusing on saying, what I was going to say was, people that know Southern Gold, you did have a project in Australia way back when. Simon, well, isn't that just like South Korea? Why South Korea? I mean, has there been, I know it's one of the most underexplored countries in Asia, I believe.
Yes.
What has drawn you to South Korea? Has there been gold found in South Korea in the past? And what's it like as a jurisdiction?
Yes, yeah. So as a jurisdiction, it's quite unique in terms of operations. It brings significant challenges. It's quite a difficult environment to operate in, but perhaps not for the reasons you're thinking. The risks around Korea are actually very low. So, for example, their tenure system is a very good one. It's a little bit unusual, the way they grant tenure. It's certainly not a Western tenure, and it's what I would say designed more for a prospector rather than, a modern explorer, foreign company type explorer. So, for example, the tenure grant sizes are quite small, which is one of the reasons why when we present it in presentations, it's perhaps a little bit different to what you see for a typical junior carry. So, in Australia, you can often see, someone will put up their presentation, there will be a map showing the tenure, which is the size of a small European country, and there'll be half a dozen projects on it, one of which is a flagship project, right? And I often get asked, so what's your flagship project? And really, that's not the way it really operates in Korea. And it's probably one of the reasons why a lot of people struggle when they go there. The way to think about it is that our flagship project is really a flagship country. We're actually exploring really the southern half of South Korea in some detail. Now, we can't put, tenure across the whole of the country. Yeah. And so what we have is we have teamwork, we have work on the ground that goes out into new areas and does the initial groundwork. This is one thing you're allowed to do in Korea, which is perhaps a bit different to other countries, is you can get on the ground, and as long as your activities are not too ground disturbing, in other words, prospecting type activities, you can do that without tenure. So you can go anywhere you want and look for things. So in a sense, the whole country is open. Now, the trick, of course, is getting tenure granted once you actually find something of interest. And therein lies the system where they only grant tenure if you can demonstrate to the authorities that you're actually onto something. So in other words, it is a system that really stops the land banking. You know
Yeah,
how some
I'm
companies
just about to say that. Yeah, it
yeah.
actually makes. I think it's a better way of doing it, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And so you know how I said before, the Australian companies will have big land packages and
Yep.
then, you know, work on half a dozen projects, one of which is a flagship over a large area. And then if they find something, they'll apply for a mining lease and then mine that deposit and so on. In the Korean system, it's a little bit like in the Korean mine that when you get that smaller license, that is a mining lease, right? It's in their minds, it's something that you're going to mine.
Right.
You've demonstrated economic validity, et cetera, et cetera. So the psychology of it, in a sense, is quite different to a Western system. So that requires some adjustment on the part of a foreign operator in how you operate. It also means that when you work on the ground and you're developing up your intellectual property, that's a very valuable thing, and you have to be careful in how you protect that. And so that often has impacts on the way we present our projects in our corporate presentations and things like that. So you'll see, you know, typically I'll show a map of Korea and there'll be half a dozen projects that are highlighted. They're ones that have been granted by the Korean government. But sitting behind all that is actually a much larger exploration activity level, where we've got guys on the ground prospecting new areas, soil sampling over others, and there's a lot of stuff going on, which doesn't necessarily make a news release, but nonetheless is feeding into this intellectual property base that we have. And we don't make a big song and dance about it because we're not trying to give away our secrets, if you know what I mean. So, and we've spent some years building these up. So we probably understand the country better than anyone right now.
Sorry to interrupt you, Simon. Are there other companies out there doing what you're doing? In other words, can they go across over the land that you've been doing some work on and do exactly the same thing? Are there others doing what you're doing?
Not really, no. There is, you know, small private companies that operate in Korea. They're relatively small. Certainly not publicly listed, publicly funded activities such as ours. So as far as I'm aware, we're the only group looking for precious metals. There's some other companies that are involved in things like tungsten and graphite to sort of greater and lesser extents. But no one is really doing what I would call modern, systematic, first-class exploration looking for precious metals on a country scale, which is what we're doing. And you know, it's a hard thing to quantify, but you know, I think we're doing something unique. And going to your question too, Kerry, about why the hell are you doing it? Like, why are you going through the trouble of, you know, why bother? And the reason for it is quite simple, actually. We have a very strong belief that there is a world-class system to be found there.
Oh.
And we know, and in particular, an epithermal system, a world-class epithermal system. Now, Ivanhoe Mines, you know, the old Robert Friedland group, they were active in country back in the 90s. They made several discoveries of epithermal systems. These were extremely high grade, but they weren't huge. They weren't what I would call sort of tier one type deposits. They were, you know, a couple of 100,000 ounces in scale. It made a lot of good money. And in fact, some of them are still being mined to this day, by the way. So there's nothing wrong with that, except the reason
Sorry, Simon, are they being mined still by Ivanhoe? Are they still there? Or?
No. Ivanhoe left the country when it made, basically it made its big world-class discoveries in Mongolia. So the old Yultoboys of the world. And for understandable reasons, they concentrated on a world-class discovery and packed up and basically left Korea back in the 90s. Well, late 1990s, early 2000s. Early 2000s, I think it was, when they moved on. And no one's sort of really gone back there to do systematic exploration sort of ever since. So Southern Gold is really the reignition or the restart of that old Ivanhoe effort. Now, the thing about the Ivanhoe days is that it demonstrated that there is indeed very high-grade economic mineralisation to be discovered in country. They did it. In fact, they found 3 deposits. And we're there because we want to try and reactivate that effort, but to actually find the big one. We think it's got all the right architecture. It's got proven mineralisation. It's been done before. And yes, it's perhaps not the easiest environment to operate in terms of some of the kind of unusual tenure systems and things like that, and how we have to present it to the investment community is a little bit challenging at times.
Yeah.
But the fundamental thesis of the potential of the country is an extremely strong one. And it's one of the reasons why we have such a first-class team that has come to join us to actually be part of that effort.
I'm going to talk to you about your team in a minute because I want to talk a couple of things. I want to talk about COVID and stuff. But before I do,
yeah,
in terms of a time frame, I know that right now, and I want to talk numbers as well, your market cap's about 15 mil. I think you've got a drill for equity for 1.5 mil. So that's a bit more, if you like, cash in the bank. You're not going to be spending cash on drilling. Are you doing a lot of drilling? I mean, paint us a little bit of the picture of, you're talking about finding a tier one. You're saying that you believe that there are world-class discoveries to be made in South Korea. And I know that with mining, sometimes you can get lucky and bingo, there it is, but that's quite unusual. Time frame, what are you doing? What's the news flow looking like for shareholders? Because I think it's important for shareholders to understand the bigger picture.
Yeah, sure. So we are drilling, and we're drilling a project called Dokon at the moment. And it would be fair to say, Gary, that with the COVID-19 situation, we're not drilling as much as we would like.
Okay.
And one of the core fundamental reason for that is that we haven't been able to get our expatriates up into the country for the last, let's call it 18 months.
Right.
And so what that means is that your technical engine room of the company has been a bit constrained in terms of the generation of new targets and new projects. So the thing to remember with new discoveries is that the key way you do that is you've got guys out on the ground kicking the rocks, taking the samples and generating the targets and having all those drilled. Now, you need to have, so in other words, you have to have a very full drill pipeline. You expect to drill a lot of targets, many of which will just fall over and not generate the right results. But because you've got your engine room going, you've got more and more coming through the pipeline. And as you know, it's a bit of a numbers game. You go out and test a number of targets.
Yeah.
Eventually, you'll stumble on the thing that's actually, hits the big time. Let's take Ivanhoe as an example. It's a very simple example. They had something like 20-odd geologists working in country for the early 1990s. And it took them several years of having those guys out on the ground. But ultimately, they stumbled on the first discovery they found was actually an outcrop that was only a few hundred metres from a major road.
Oh.
And they were, it's just one of those things where they went out, they looked at a lot of different projects, and then eventually they found something that was actually literally sticking out of the ground.
And some of those guys from Ivanhoe, like Doug Kerwin, didn't he? He's on your board, isn't he?
That's right. Yep.
And he was Ivanhoe, so he knows South Korea really well.
Absolutely. And he knows exactly what I'm talking about here.
But you've also appointed an exploration manager who's starting. Has he already started, or? No,
he's going to be starting very shortly. So he's obviously finishing up in his last role with GNS in New Zealand. But then Robert Smillie is his name. Rob is going to be going up to Korea to live. So he'll be a South Korea-based exploration manager. And Rob, of course, has his own network of guys who have worked on epithermal site systems. So I'm sure he'll be picking up the bat phone to talk to a couple of those guys and get them in country as well. And so that probably leads into or goes to that comment I made before, Kerry, about the fact that you've got your engine room of the project generation work you do in a company, which requires your really good technical guys to be on the ground kicking the rocks. And so given the COVID situation and, who knows how long that will take to resolve, we've decided to kind of essentially rebase our key technical people in country rather than trying to drive it on a fly-in, fly-out basis, which clearly wasn't going to work. So we're reposturing, if you will, get the guys out on the ground. And I suspect by, let's call it early next year, we'll probably have 4 or 5 teams of guys out on different parts of Korea in the field. And typically these teams would work for about a month or so, generating new targets. In the past, when we've done this sort of work with guys like Craig Panther, another of those ex-Ivanhoe guys who's come in to assist us and really drive a lot of our work there in Korea, and he's got all the right background for that. he was finding at least 2 or 3 drill targets in each one of those stints that he come out for in those months. So I'm quite confident that once we get back into the swing of it and we start to really try and beat the frustration of the COVID thing, we'll be generating, a dozen targets easily inside a 3 or 4 month period come early next year.
So early next year, there's going to be a lot of news flow. We've got Robert Smiley. Is it Smiley?
Smiley, I think.
Smiley. Let's call him Smiley. Robert Smiley.
That sounds
What am I calling Smiley? So he's joining you. And you've got 8 mil in the bank. You've got a 1.5 mil draw for equity. You've done this other deal. So really, with a market cap of 15 mil, the projects themselves are kind of like there's no value to them at the moment with your current market cap.
Yeah, that's right. I think that we're going to be in an unusual situation, Kerry, where our official balance sheet is going to be in much better shape than our market cap implied by the share price. So we're about to have a receivable on the balance sheet in the order of $15 million on a mark-to-market basis, 30 June. And, that's not insignificant for us. Now, look, I understand it. It's, we're an Australian listed company holding shares in a London listed company, and it's not looked at in the same way. It's not cash. We've got to emphasize that. And look, to a degree, I think that there's probably some psychology in the market that discounts it. And that's fair enough. But even if you were to be, say, very conservative and say, well, let's only attribute 50% of its value to the balance sheet or to our net tangible asset base, shall we say. Well, we've got $8 million of cash, a $1.5 million drill for equity deal, and circa, $7 or $8 million, or $6 or $7 million of value perhaps from the BMV deal at a conservative basis. Yep. That's still way north of $15 million when you all add it up. And that's where our current market cap is. So this is really indicating that if you buy the shares at current prices, you're really effectively picking up a free option on our exploration in South Korea.
Yeah, it's a free option on the, as you say, free option on the exploration ground in South Korea. Not many other people are doing it. And I guess, no one thought Gold Road was going to find anything when they went out looking for something. So I kind of look at both and go, I remember thinking, why would you go out to that area? There's nothing there. And look at them today.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
We're running out of time. I want 3 good reasons people should buy shares in Southern Gold today.
Balance sheet is in excellent shape. So we're fully funded for as far as the eye can see. We've got a first-class team, guys who have made discoveries in the past. A lot of them are ex-Ivanhoe. These are guys who actually make discoveries, not just once, but several times in their careers. So we've got brilliant people on board. And we're in a jurisdiction where no one's looking. And that's usually when you find something new.
Love it. That's what he's doing, going out where nobody else is looking. And that's where you can find something really interesting, ladies and gentlemen. So ASX code SAU. Simon Mitchell, Managing Director, Southern Gold. Thanks for joining me on Small Caps today.
Thanks, Kerry. It's been great.